Andrew Solomon is here. It was in 1998 that he published an article in the New Yorker magazine. That article generated unprecedented response. He is a well-known author and magazine contributor. He has written an explicit and painful description of his struggle with depression. That article received more than 2,000 letters from readers in the month the article was published, and it has since been published in other books. It is also the basis for his latest work, The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression. I'm pleased to have him at this table for the first time. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Lots of people have been recommending this book to me, and so I'm pleased to meet you and pleased to have introduced the book to the audience. You have said that in part you wrote this book because it was the kind of book that wasn't there that you wanted to read. Tell me what that means.
Absolutely. When I was coming out of my depression, I looked around for all the books there were on the subject, and I found that they tended to fall into one of three categories. They were incredibly personal narratives with no particular relevance to other people and other people's experiences, right. Or they were extremely technical, dry, scientific documents, or they were self-help manuals written in that sort of Sally hadn't been feeling well for some time kind of vocabulary. And I wanted to write a synthetic book in which I brought together the philosophical, the psychological, the emotional, the political, the social, all the different views that there were on depression, and come up with a kind of unified field theory that
and kind of
put it all
an atlas, as the subtitle says,
exactly.
An atlas of depression. What is it that needs to be said about depression? I mean, we know all the people who have come forward since Bill Styron, celebrities and non-celebrities, all economic strata. We understand, you know, that it is now at the cause of so much pain and suffering. What is it that we didn't know that you wanted to tell us?
Well, there are a few things that I wanted to say. First and foremost, I think, is that there is an enormous range of treatments available for depression, and people don't understand quite how broad the options are. I think people don't know how treatable depression really is and how many ways there are of approaching it. The second thing is that depression is not simply a Western middle-class affliction. It's something that's existed throughout history. It's existed across societies. I traveled around the world and looked at how it had affected all kinds of different people, and all kinds of different economic groups looked at depression among the very poor and so on. The third thing is that I think depression does have a certain amount of redemptive value, not while you're in it, but after you've come out of it. I wanted to try to see what it is that people are able to extract from their experience of depression, and to see in what way people who have been through depression have richer and more intense lives in consequence of it.
Is there a common denominator in terms of what people extract?
I think people extract a certain intensity of emotion, and they extract, in many instances, a more profound kindness, a deeper empathy, and a more vivid awareness of the joy of their own everyday lives.
You know, you were bipolar?
No, unipolar.
Unipolar,
yes.
Because more and more people that I know are bipolar, you know, so they go both ways. What's more predominant, unipolar or bipolar?
Unipolar is much more common than bipolar, but increasingly the definitions are blurring, and lots of people are what's called bipolar 2, which means that they have depression, and then they get a little bit manic, but they don't get psychotically manic, and then they have depression again. I actually might fall into that category. The doctors keep changing the way they analyze these things.
What kind of medication was appropriate?
For bipolar, people need to be on a mood stabilizer. They need different medication from people who are unipolar. I myself, at the moment, take a cocktail of Effexor, Wellbutrin, Buspar, Zyprexa, and Topamax.
Every day?
Every day.
And what does it do for you?
It prevents me from lapsing into that really terrible, terrified, horrible, devitalized feeling of depression that makes it impossible for me even to get up and tie my shoelaces. It cuts that very bottom, hysterical, crazy part of the cycle out, and allows me to have the pain and suffering that I have in better and more valuable places.
For the lack of a better way of expressing this, and I know you've said this 1,000 times, including the book, what does it feel like? I mean, what does it mean to feel like I don't want to get up, I can't get up and tie my shoelaces, I can't get up and go to the telephone, I cannot get up?
It was just amazing to me when it happened to me. I'd read about it, I'd heard about it, but I had no idea what it was like until I found myself beginning to find ordinary things of daily life so much more effortful than they'd ever been, and so unpleasant. I would get home and I would listen to the messages on my answering machine, and I would think, how can I call back all those people? And I would just think, what a lot of work that's going to be. And then it got to be more and more acute, and I began thinking, I have to get up and put on both of my socks and then both of my shoes. And in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, this is ridiculous. Everyone gets up and puts on both of his socks and then both of his shoes, but it still just seemed like such an effort. And finally, I got to the point at which I would go into the bathroom and stare at the toothbrush and think, I can't put the toothpaste on the toothbrush and put it in my mouth and brush all my teeth. And then eventually, I got to the point which was really rock bottom, when I felt I couldn't actually move. I was lying in bed, absolutely frozen, and I thought I'd had a stroke. I couldn't think how else to explain it.
When did you say, I've got to get help?
Then was when I was absolutely paralyzed that I said, something has gone horribly wrong.
And depression was not one of the choices that you had in mind, or was it?
Well, I had begun thinking a little while before that, gee, I guess maybe what I'm developing is a severe depression. And at that point, I thought to myself, I guess I'm severely depressed. But it had moved so far beyond the basic negative feelings I'd associated with that word that I thought there must be something else too.
Were you suicidal?
I became suicidal afterward. At that point, I was so devitalized that suicide, which required activity on my part, was beyond anything I could imagine. Later, when I was on medication and I was beginning to come out of it and beginning to get better, I was so distraught at how far I'd fallen and so horrified at the things that had happened to me that I felt very self-destructive, and that was when I wanted to kill myself.
From that point, say, to today, with a very, very successful book and lots of magazine articles about you, as well as the book, what have you learned that's most important to convey?
I think I've learned that mood states are temporary and that your emotions lie to you a lot of the time, and that your reality is based very much on perception, and that your perceptions shift around, so that what seems to be absolutely true isn't necessarily true, and that you have to keep a little bit of your mind hard and logical, and you can't allow a false reality to take over. There was a period when I thought that I was useless, that my life was hopeless, that there was no point going on, that everything was terrible, and it wasn't so. Actually, my life is kind of terrific, and I'm very happy in it. But there was a time when I didn't believe that that could possibly be the case.
And if you were manic, you would feel like, you're not bipolar, but if you were manic, you'd feel like there's nothing I can't do.
Absolutely.
You know, I can write the greatest American novel and make the greatest American film and win the NBA Finals.
And the thing is to hold on to some little piece of yourself, if you possibly can, that says through all of this, what I believe I shouldn't believe, that holds on to reality somehow, cling to reality, I guess. That's one of the things that I've learned. I
thought you might say, when I said what's the most important thing you learned, which was that no matter how deep the depths of despair, that there was hope, that science, this was treatable, this was understandable, and that you were not the first person to be here, and others had come back, and so could you.
Well, that's absolutely one of the things one learns. I mean, I very much feel that I'm not alone. And in the course of writing this book and meeting so many people who had sunk so low, and so many people who had sunk so low and then managed to come back, I just had the sense that this is a very common affliction. I mean, it affects so many people. You know, when you're writing a book about depression, you go to a party and you say, I'm writing a book about depression. And when you're in a group of people, everyone sort of laughs nervously.
Sure.
And then one by one, every single person comes up to you and says, I don't talk about it that often, but, you know, I have this happen.
Every single person?
Everybody either has his own story or has a story about my sister, my friend, my cousin.
Yeah.
Every single person, yes. It affects directly or indirectly everyone.
Has it changed because, is there stigma today, or has all that changed because of Kay Jameson and Bill Styron and Mike Wallace and Art Buchwald and on and on and on and on?
There's a lot less stigma than there used to be, but there's still enormous stigma. I had an amazing experience actually a while ago. There's a couple I know slightly socially, and at one point the woman called me up and she said, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about something that's been going on. I've been taking these antidepressants because I've had a depression problem, but I really don't want anyone to know, and please don't tell my husband because he could never understand. And we had a long discussion about it, and I gave her some advice about what she was going through. And about 3 weeks later, I got a phone call from her husband, and he said, listen, I don't want anyone to know about this, and my wife wouldn't respect me as a man if she knew, but I've been taking these antidepressants, and they were on the same medication, and neither of them had told the other one. People are so busy hiding it. Yeah. It's incredible.
And they call you because they've known that you have lived with depression, or they call you because they know you've written The Noonday Demon?
Well, some of each. Because I've written The Noonday Demon, they know I've lived with depression, and they think I've got information that will help them.
And that you're a friend, and so therefore they can have a confidential conversation and go no further.
Exactly. And I didn't tell either of them what was going on.
And what
with
did
the
you
other.
tell them, though?
I told each of them that I thought,
You should go
I
home
gave
and have
them
a
lots of
conversation
technical
with their
information, and I
spouse.
said, a strong marriage is one of the best things, and I think it would be very good if you could be honest with your spouse and talk about this openly.
Do you think how did they end up telling each other at the same time?
So far as I know, they haven't told each other. Maybe they'll see this program and recognize themselves.
Well, I suspect they will. I mean, I'm going to go comb your friends' list to find out. But I mean, it is true that no one knows the life that others are living in terms of these kinds of things. You know, I mean, you must have had so many people come up, not just those people who have been touched by it, but who say, "Help me, help me,
Yes.
help me."
Huge numbers of people. And I feel as though, actually, it's one of the responsibilities you take on when you write a book like this, is to help people who come to you in that way. I have huge numbers of letters from strangers, but also so many people who I know, frequently people I know slightly, but also people who I know well, who then call me up and say, this has suddenly happened, that suddenly happened, or this has always been true, or that's always been true. People suffer from depression, and they don't know where to turn, they don't know where to look. And I hope that I can be a resource for people, but I also hope the Noonday Demon can be a resource for people and can show them how you begin to deal with depression when you feel it setting in and when you begin to be subject to its onslaught. Because I think ignorance is the thing that will cast you into deeper and deeper and deeper depression.
I know Kay Jameson reasonably well, who was depressed, as you know, wrote a book about it, and also wrote a book about suicide, and attempted suicide in her own way. What is it that causes depression?
I think everybody is born with, almost everybody is born with some degree of vulnerability to depression. Now, if you're born with a low degree of vulnerability, you have to have a very extreme circumstance to trigger your depression. If you're born with a high degree of vulnerability, you need only a very slight circumstance to trigger your depression. In all cases, it's a mixture of a genetic vulnerability and things that happen to you in the outside world. And when those things come together, you have a depression that blossoms out of them.
What happens if they take your cocktail away?
Well, I think if you have got a repeating cyclical depression, which is what I have, and you go off medication, the evidence is very strong that eventually you'll cycle back into a depression and have another breakdown. And that's a really unpleasant
That's the likelihood,
prospect.
isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it's almost a certainty. I mean, very few people, I don't want to go out on medical, go out beyond what I know, but my impression is that if you take those people who are taking some kind of chemical treatment, if they stop, the depression reappears, and you're just back at the same place.
Yes, lots of people seem to think you take antidepressants for depression and they make you well, and then you can stop taking them like antibiotics.
Right.
But actually, you take them the way that you take heart medicine.
Right.
You take them, they make you well by changing chemical balances in your brain, and then you go on taking them so that those chemical balances stay changed in your brain. If you go off them, you'll slide right back again.
What are the most important medical advances?
The most important medical advances, I think, are the developments in SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Prozac was the first, as they make more and more of them. The advance is really not so much how well they work, because there are older medications that work equally well. It's how few side effects they have. You can take medication now without really suffering too much as a consequence of taking it. The older medications were very hard to tolerate. And I think we're moving toward medications that will be faster. The current medications take quite a long time to kick in and be effective, and that are easier to tolerate. I also think we're making a lot of progress with kinds of talking therapies. You actually can achieve the same shifts in brain chemistry with certain kinds of talking therapies that you can achieve with certain medications. But it takes much longer for them to work, and they don't work in extreme cases.
What's a talking therapy?
Psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioral therapy, all kinds of therapies in which you sit opposite a psychiatrist and you talk to each other and you try to change your thought patterns and you change the way that your mind works.
You can do that. It's not as immediate.
It's not as immediate.
You can do it.
It's not as effective, but in fact, you change the way that your brain is working by changing the way you think, and you change the way that you think by taking medications that change the way your brain is working. You can do it either way.
The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression, Andrew Solomon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for joining us. See you next time. Andrew Solomon is here. It was in 1998 that he published an article in the New Yorker magazine. That article generated unprecedented response. He is a well-known author and magazine contributor. He has written an explicit and painful description of his struggle with depression. That article received more than 2,000 letters.
And I wanted to write a synthetic book in which I brought together the philosophical, the psychological, the emotional, the political, the social, all the different views that there were on depression, and come up with a kind of unified field theory that
and kind of
put
provide
it all
an atlas, as the subtitle says,
exactly.
an atlas of depression. What is it that needs to be said? From readers in the month the article was published, and it has since been published in other books. It is also the basis for his latest work, The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression. I'm pleased to have him at this table for the first time. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Lots of people have been recommending this book to me, and so I'm pleased
to fall into one of three categories. They were incredibly personal narratives with no particular relevance to other people and other people's experiences, or they were extremely technical, dry, scientific documents, or they were self-help manuals written in that sort of Sally hadn't been feeling well for some time kind of vocabulary.
Meet you, and pleased to have introduced the book to the audience. You have said that in part you wrote this book because it was the kind of book that wasn't there that you wanted to read. Tell me what that means.
Absolutely. When I was coming out of my depression, I looked around for all the books there were on the subject, and I found that they tended